Hey Canada, you guys okay up there? I know it's been a bit rough, what with the fires and the drought and the Beetles and all that. It's tough, I know, but let's talk about what's happening with Canadian lumber. So things are tough for the lumber industry in Canada right now. One of the biggest problems are the recent wildfires that have been burning in Quebec and sending smoke and ash throughout the eastern US. I've had a few people ask me how these fires will impact lumber and lumber prices, so let's get into it. The first thing to understand is where these fires are located and what kind of forests are burning. These fires are unusual in that they have occurred in an area that doesn't normally have wildfires. The forests of Quebec are really similar to the forests of, say, Pennsylvania or New York or Maine. They're mixed forests with both deciduous trees or hardwoods and coniferous trees or softwoods. And they tend to be pretty wet and cold. We're used to wildfires happening in the west, but wildfires in the east are far less common. Again, because of the weather, but also because hardwood trees are less prone to fire than softwood trees for various reasons. Now, I have heard a lot of people who see these fires as suspicious because they all seem to start at the same time. And while I understand that they may look suspicious, it really is not unusual for dry, windy conditions mixed with lightning storms to cause fires like this. So how will all of this impact lumber prices? Well, the fires in eastern Canada got a lot of publicity because of how they spread smoke and dropped soot on places like New York City, but they took place in forests where softwood lumber is not harvested in great amounts, and so the impact on construction lumber prices really should be minimal. Now, I'm not sure exactly where the fires took place, but I do know that in that part of Quebec there are a lot of maple trees, and so if anything, it may have an impact on the cost of maple syrup. Sorry for the stereotype, Canada, but sometimes stereotypes are true. Hardwood prices may also be affected, but we won't really know the full impact until all the smoke is cleared. Now, the much bigger problem is what's going on in Western Canada, where wildfires have been burning in Alberta and British Columbia. In fact, Canada is on track this year for the worst wildfire season on record, as over 5 million hectares or 12.5 million acres have burned so far, and we're only in the beginning of the season. To put that into perspective, in the US in 2022, wildfires destroyed around 7 million acres. And you'd have to go back to the 1950s to find a fire year in the US that has destroyed as much as has been destroyed in Canada so far this year. Now, I do just want to sidetrack us for a moment and go back to this graph here. The thing that stands out here is this huge hump in the 1930s when over 50 million acres burned in the US. It was a crazy time, and if you're interested in learning more about it, I made a video that I'll link here and in the description that tells that story and explains how the way that we fight fires can actually have negative impacts to the health of forests and increase the intensity and damage that wildfires can do. Anyway, back to Canada. The worst fire year in Canada was in 1995 when around 7 million hectares burned, which would be about 17 million acres. And like I say, Canada is on track right now to surpass that this year. These fires have been happening because of dry and hot conditions. In fact, this past May in Canada was one of the hottest on record, and there are concerns in Alberta that there may not be enough rain for many of the crops to grow.
Crops that should be green are turning brown. With little to no measurable precipitation since mid-April in areas south of Calgary, the harvest is already looking bleak.
For the lack of better terms, we're on the road to zero production here in this area.
That is in sharp contrast to what's happening in the western US this year. In the western US, there have been a few years of drought and dangerous fire conditions, but not this year. This past winter was one of the wettest on record, and the past few months have also been cool and wet. So that means that the fire season in the US will likely be much less severe than usual. But back to Canada. Aside from the hot and dry conditions, the boreal forests of Western Canada have been plagued by pine beetles that are leaving millions of dead trees in their wake. These trees just stick around until someone either comes to harvest them, they fall and decay on their own, or they catch fire, and they often catch fire. Now, all of this has been a great challenge to the Canadian logging industry. There are fewer stands of healthy trees to harvest, and a lot of the easily harvested beetle kill trees have already been harvested. That, combined with new government regulations which prohibit logging in some old growth forests, mean that the Canadian logging industry is in deep trouble and has been declining for years. The other challenge is that Canadian lumber is currently subject to US tariffs of over 8%. Now, I've made a few videos on lumber tariffs, including this one about how lumber tariffs are a scam. And you can check them out here if you like. But the impact is that Canadian lumber in the US is more expensive than domestic lumber, and so the US doesn't buy all that much Canadian lumber. The biggest markets for Canadian lumber are China and Japan. And with the Chinese economy just off the heels of COVID bans and growing more slowly generally, the demand for Canadian lumber is shrinking. So how are Canadian lumber companies responding? Well, they're doing two things. First, they're closing mills in Canada. This is having a devastating impact on local communities and damaging local economies.
After more than 55 years of operation, Canfor's pulp and paper mill in Prince George is about to close its doors. The mill's closure is expected to result in more than 100 job losses.
The second thing that they're doing is buying up lumber mills in the US. This does two things for them. First, it allows them to avoid tariffs on Canadian lumber. And second, it lets them into areas of the South where the lumber industry is growing. West Fraser, Interfor, and Canfor are all Canadian lumber companies that have made investments in the US totaling in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So the fires in Ontario will have a limited impact on lumber prices, mainly because of the mixed nature of the forests and the limited logging of construction lumber that takes place there. Maple syrup prices and hardwood lumber prices will likely be affected as well. The fires in British Columbia, on the other hand, are much more significant. Not only are the forests themselves being destroyed, but lumber mills near those forests are having to shut down temporarily due to safety and other issues. This constrains the supply of lumber, which could have the effect of increasing prices. If we look at a graph of lumber futures prices, we'll see that the price has gone up by 10% since the beginning of June. But that is still within the range of the last 90 days or so. As long as fires are contained, and they don't disrupt the operations of sawmills in any significant way, then prices should remain stable because the supply shouldn't be affected terribly. But if the Canadian wildfire season gets out of hand, then we could see a more significant impact to supply and then also to prices, something that we're going to have to keep our eye on. So the fires in Ontario will have a limited impact on lumber prices. The fires in British Columbia are much more significant and will impact the lumber supply. But with mills closing and the Canadian lumber industry in decline, I'm not sure the long-term impacts of all of this. But if you are Canadian, hang in there. I hope things get better for you soon. Thanks for watching. I have a lot more videos planned on lumber and lumber prices, so be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.